Hi everyone, I'm Anthony O'Flynn, and this video or series of videos is actually going to be focusing on the current state of the Australian collective soul, the Australian egregor, and it will be in parts. And I was meaning to make this video for quite some time actually this year, but I actually decided to wait until after the results of the referendum to see what the mood of the nation was. So there are key moments in the collective consciousness, in the collective soul, that really illustrate or highlight where the collective is. Now, the collective may not apply some of the characteristics, the traits, the observations, the direction of the Australian soul to you individually watching this, but it has an influence on the collective. So what your responsibility is, or your focus is to basically ascertain how you fit into the collective as an individual, and how the collective fits into the individual. So it's like a two-way street. How the individual fits into the collective and how the collective fits into the individual. So I'm going to define what the collective is. Firstly, this term egregor is a very good word to use, which is a French word coming from the French and also the ancient Greek. So it really is the expression of the collective consciousness, the collective soul, the national soul. It's basically in metaphysics considered to be a non-physical entity in this way. Now, you can have a collective soul in even a city, like the characteristics, the defining traits of a city, of population. You can have it in a sporting team. You can have it in a culture of a business. It's not just defined to nations per se, but it definitely is the idea of a collective consciousness. It's also used in aspects of magic. It is an esoteric concept, but I won't be focusing on that today. But it's been used a lot in metaphysics. The great French metaphysician Rene Guénon, he referred to it basically as a collective entity. That it is an entity, but a lot of the times people think of entity as some sort of parasite or demonic entity. It's not necessarily good or bad, but it is a collective field of consciousness, if you want to think of it like that. It perhaps isn't like an entity in the sense that, you know, people would imagine it would have arms and legs or something like this, but it is a field that we absorb in a certain way and we also contribute to. So this is important to understand. Also, your relationship with the egregor, and I'm talking about in national terms now with the Australian egregor, will be determined by your own consciousness. Now, in the old days, the collective consciousness in terms of a nation was easier to actually identify and to unpack. Because of travel, because basically people would grow up in a village, live in a village, die in a village, and there wouldn't be many people who are traveling around so much. So this means that nations didn't have the same level of migration as what they do today. Now, in this context, I'm not saying migration is a good thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm saying that it influences or dilutes the egregor itself, because it will have an influence ultimately on the collective. So the bigger the different levels of migration, the bigger the influence on the collective. It is relevant specifically for a country like Australia, because in the context of this series of videos, basically I'm referring to the collective Australia as it is now, not going back to thousands and thousands of years with the Indigenous culture only. So in this way, how is the Indigenous culture influencing the collective today? Where are the roots coming from for this idea of Australia being like an earthy nation in a certain way, enjoying things like camping, the outdoors, these sort of qualities? Are they derived from Indigenous culture? And also the migration, for example, in the first, second fleet, this kind of migration from mostly coming from England itself, how the egregor is built. So Australia in some ways is a more challenging egregor to evaluate, because it doesn't have a long heritage in terms of the arrival of the first fleet in terms of years. And the migration that we're seeing over the last 20, 30 years is shifting the collective dynamic significantly. So again, this is not a good thing, it's not a bad thing, it's how does the collective feel generated. So the idea of the egregor is an expression of archetypes. So we think of this idea of iconic Australians, archetypes. Now, the archetype is important because when you think of the values of a traditional Australian, you're actually tapping into the idea of archetypes, which is a really big component of Jung's work and so on. So the idea that there are these archetypes is a reflection of the collective traits expressed in an individual, like an iconic type of Australian, we think of it like that. But a lot of the time you actually see beyond the persona, and persona in Latin is mask, beyond the image is very much different, the person or the characteristics beyond that. And at a deeper level, you can see that that is actually what the real archetype actually really is, not the actual first impressions, like the more superficial aspects of things, but this idea of archetypes. Who is the archetypal Australian? Is it a famous celebrity? Is it someone who's not living? Is it all these sorts of things? And first thing to say is on this is that we in Australia do not really have a lot of self-awareness around who we really are as a nation. We're very good at perhaps mocking and ridiculing some of the other nations, such as the USA, for their failings and their shadow and so on. But in Australia, we're actually not really mature enough yet to see our own shadow, our own limitations when it comes to this. And this process has actually started since the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. And the reality is that the Australia that we're living in today is not the one that we thought we were living in, or the one that we have, or the one we grew up in. So how you relate to the egregor will be basically directly your level of consciousness. And by that, the higher the level of consciousness you have, the less you'll actually be influenced by the egregor, because there'll be a separation. So you won't basically go on to mass trends and so on. And we have this idea of this archetype. For example, tonight, I think it's the World Cup, One Day Cricket World Cup in Australia. And we have this idea of this, back to my previous point, that Australians are like good sports. Like it's an expression in Australia to be a good sport. But what about in regard to the recent scandals in Australian cricket of cheating? And also this wokeism, this idea of a virtue signalling. Is that representation of the collective soul? Is that who we really are? Is that who we really want to be? So I'll be in this series exposing a lot of the myths of Australian culture. It is going to be quite confronting for a lot of people to actually become aware of the country that we're living in, because many of the illusions are starting to fade of the kind of Australia, particularly if you're a Gen X or a boomer, of the Australia that we grew up in. Those values, for example, do we exhibit the qualities of the Anzacs today? Do we exhibit the qualities of the diggers today, which was over 100 years ago now, World War One? Is that a myth? Who are we really as a people? Who are we as a collective? And who are we, where are we going as a collective? I'll just make a couple more points before I wrap up this video, but in my observations, there's been two radical changes in the egregor that began, and I can't put a week or a month or even a year on this, in the early 2000s, and that was related to consumerism, to materialism particularly, and greed as expressed in things like property. And this was the perpetuation of this major shift in the egregor, the collective. And the next change was obviously in the 2020, 2021, the expression of consciousness that was clear in the collective through the the pandemic. So this group mind is very, very influential on the direction of consciousness and how we relate to the collective, how the collective relates to us back, how do we input to the collective. And the other point is that we are still in the process of truly coming into the idea of understanding the collective in Australia. And the other thing to say is that the collective is actually in a state of deep confusion at the moment. It's been going on for a couple of years. This might not apply to you. Again, I can't reiterate this enough. You may not embody these qualities of the collective, but they're in the collective subconscious mind. So much of the prelude to this are these two key temporal markers, the early 2000s. I would say something like 2002, 2003, around there, maybe even 2004, this early part of the 2000s, and 2020, 2021 onwards have brought us to this point of the collective consciousness being in a state of deep confusion at many, many levels. Confusion around authority, confusion around trust in the government, trust in the media, trust in people trusting in themselves, people realizing that they are their own personal values are completely dominated by the collective, which is to be expected, and that perhaps the collective is not in a good way at all in this country. And the confusion is also at an existential level as far as the actual purpose, the meaning of life, but that is not dominant. It's still, you can see aspects of it in terms of the suicide rate, in terms of alcoholism, these sorts of things, drug addiction, whatever. But the confusion is a fear of the future as well, and it's really summed up in the question, where to from here? Because we are living through a time of rapid change. People do not have any anchor or way of coping mechanisms around many of these things, and this is where the confusion is coming from. Who should I trust? Who should I put my trust in? What should I put my trust in? The institutions, the systems are failing a little bit, and failing us individually and failing the collective. So there will be increased turmoil in the collective across this decade, and increased confusion, and also increased change in the egregor. The egregor is also changing in many positive ways in Australia, which I'll get to. But again, the collective is, it's like a big mass of consciousness, like a big kind of all these thought forms, values, beliefs, behaviors, all feeding into the collective. So I'll leave this here for now. This is the part one of this. I'll go into the part two. I've spent quite a lot of time really attuning myself to the collective to try to decipher where we're at. There are many overlaps with the Australian collective with other nations. Obviously there's a collective on this planet as well, which is the dominant consciousness on this planet. And many of these patterns are exhibited worldwide. Some of them are socially engineered, and that's part of the collective as well, that have been implanted sort of artificially in a way by the process of social engineering. But we'll get to see who we really are, and beyond the propaganda, beyond the spin, beyond the myths, beyond the sort of glossy media type stereotypes of who we really are. And as I said, the collective in Australia, as much as it is a state of confusion, there's also a lot of positives happening. Actually, there are a lot of positives happening, and we'll see where this is going to go in the next video. Thanks for watching. We live in epic times.